University and her bachelor's in philosophy from Marquette University. Her area of specialty is medieval philosophy. However, she teaches on a range of courses in the history of philosophy, especially ancient and medieval, Augustine and Aquinas, and ethics at Nazareth University, where she is currently an assistant professor in philosophy. Tonight's topic is happiness and the desire for knowledge in Augustine and Aquinas. So, Dr. Samz.
It's actually one of the bigger audiences that I've ever spoken in front of, and I'm glad that I know a lot of you, so it's good. So, like the ancient Greek philosophers that inspired them, Latin medieval philosophers and theologians such as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas recognized the existence of three central human desires: the desire for happiness, the desire for love, and the desire for knowledge. Arguably, in contemporary American society, the most disputable of these is the desire for knowledge. It seems that few people would question the universal longing to be happy or to love and be loved. But is learning something that everyone really desires? Furthermore, what does the desire for knowledge have to do with the desire for happiness? By considering the works of Augustine and Aquinas, especially Augustine's dialogues on the happy life against the academics and the soliloquies, and Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, I suggest that we can notice how the contemporary skepticism about the universality of the desire for knowledge and its essential relationship to happiness arises from a separation of not only happiness from virtue, which many philosophers have rightly noted as a trend in modern times, but also knowledge from virtue. In particular, there has been a loss of the connection between learning and moderation, as well as a reduction of wisdom to instrumental utilitarian forms of knowledge. However, we might regain a genuine connection between knowledge and virtue through a return to a more holistic conception of education aimed at human happiness. Let us begin by considering what Augustine and Aquinas mean by happiness. To begin with, it is worth unpacking their claim that all human beings desire happiness. This means that happiness is a natural, innate longing in us as human beings with a human nature. Augustine and Aquinas take it as obvious that we want to be happy. It is a premise easily granted. They maintain that happiness is the ultimate end for which we act. It is our purpose, that which we are seeking above all. Of course, the term happiness is notoriously ambiguous, not only in English translation, but also in Latin. Still, human beings speak very often of happiness, of wanting to be happy themselves. And loved ones often say to each other, "I just want you to be happy." Think of a parent offering advice to a child who needs to make a significant life decision. Or think of two close friends in deep conversation when one of them is going through a difficult time. There is a common notion of happiness behind these sentiments and expressions of love, even if people tend to disagree about the means to happiness, how to achieve it, or what they need to become happy. They will nevertheless be seeking happiness as the end goal. In his treatise on happiness contained in the Summa, Aquinas recognizes this common notion of happiness as of a perfect or complete good. Thus, as he says, the perfect good for a human being is whatever wholly satisfies his will. To desire happiness is simply to desire that one's will be wholly satisfied, and this everyone desires. Put another way, happiness is what the human heart ultimately longs for. It is the quenching of our deepest thirst, as it were. Happiness, as the ultimate end of human life, so entirely satisfies the human being's desire that there is nothing left for him to desire. It cannot be his ultimate end if something additional is left for him to desire. The happy person, then, is the one who has all he wants, or whose every wish is fulfilled, Aquinas concludes. In turn, happiness is as much the absence of need as the fulfillment of desire, Augustine emphasizes. The distinction between wants and needs is not really present if one understands wants as genuine human needs. Perhaps this is also why Augustine links misery with the presence of need, and have happiness with the absence of need. According to him, misery is nothing other than need, and everyone who isn't miserable is happy. Therefore, he who is without need is happy if it is established that what we are calling need is the same as misery. That is to say, happiness is fulfillment, having everything one needs, lacking nothing, being complete. However, perplexities arise once we ask ourselves, what do I truly need and want? What is it that will satisfy or fulfill me completely? Moreover, in one sense, having what you want and need might not actually make you happy, as Aquinas and Augustine acknowledge. We have the expression, be careful what you wish for, after all. It seems then what is important is that you want what is actually beneficial for you, not merely what appears good to you. This is why Augustine adds that the happy person is the one who has all he wants and wants what is good. In his dialogue on the happy life, Augustine emphasizes that if he wants good things and has them, a person is happy. But if he wants bad things, he is unhappy, even if he has them. Aquinas also highlights that only what is good can make one happy. Since happiness is the human being's highest good, it is not compatible with any evil, and no evil can come to the human being from it. In other words, Augustine and Aquinas concur that only good things make one happy, and happiness is the ultimate good for a person. It is beneficial. Something harmful or vicious will not contribute to happiness, but to unhappiness. Only what is beneficial or virtuous contributes to happiness. Therefore, happiness is not simply a fulfillment of prima facie desires or wants. A human being who wants things that are not beneficial for himself is not happy, according to Augustine. Happiness is not simply feeling pleasure or fulfilling subjective desires, for happiness is an objective state of being and requires receiving certain goods that enable a human being to be who he or she truly is. But even here, difficulties arise. For one could actually want good things, have good things, and still not be happy. The classic example is money or wealth, which can be a genuine good insofar as it is linked to human sustenance. A person says, I will be happy once I have X number of dollars. That person gets X number of dollars, and that person is not happy. In these cases, people sometimes feel a rather dull unhappiness, a kind of disappointment. Maybe they will continue trying to save more money. Maybe they misjudged how much they needed in order to be happy. Or maybe they will start looking for happiness elsewhere, placing their desire in a different pursuit. However, people can also feel not merely discontent, but despair upon achieving wealth and any number of external goods. Augustine warns about this in his dialogue on the happy life. Now, consider whether everyone who is miserable is also in need. For something makes it difficult to grant this statement. The fact that many have been placed in a great abundance of fortuitous possessions, for whom everything is so easy that whatever they crave is at their beck and call. This life of theirs is difficult indeed. Now, let's nevertheless imagine someone who is the kind of man Cicero says Orada was. For who would easily say that Orada was distressed by need? A man who was extremely wealthy, extremely charming, extremely discriminating, and who lacked nothing with respect to pleasure, influence, and good and vigorous health. For he abounded in the most lucrative estates and the most delightful friends, as much as he wanted. And all these things he used most suitably for the health of the body. And to make a long story short, prosperous success followed his every plan and his every wish. Orada is a man with all the necessary external goods for living and living well as a man. He has all the goods that fortune can provide: money, status, pleasure, health, and even friendship. However, he is unhappy, miserable. Orada himself, and surely others like him, might reasonably ask, how can this be? What explains this? Perhaps you yourself might think, if I was in his shoes, I would certainly be happy. I wouldn't mind being wealthy, healthy, popular, etc. Orada's unhappiness can seem particularly mysterious, given that people often attribute their own unhappiness to a lack of money, a lack of what money can buy, or a lack of friendship and community. Yet, cases similar to Arata's frequently appear in the news today as well. One hears of celebrities who experience great despair and whose lives end in tragedy due to it. Like with Arata, one might be left searching for some kind of explanation. It seems like these people are unhappy for no reason, and they might not even know themselves why they are unhappy. It seems absurd. Philosophers of certain times might take this as evidence of the meaninglessness or absurdity of human existence. Some people today might make a similar conclusion. However, I think that many people today are more likely to press Augustine further, insisting that Arata must still be in need of something. In particular, many people today would diagnose Arata as struggling with his mental health. Yes, perhaps his physical health is excellent, but what about his mental health, they might say. While it would take us too far afield to explore the intricate issue of medieval notions of mental health, suffice it to say that contemporary conceptions of mental health fail to cover all that Augustine and Aquinas would find missing in the case of Arata. They are too reductionistic in their understanding of the mind. However, Augustine would agree with the insistence that there really is something Arata is missing in his life. He really is in need. What Arata really needs, though, is not simply or necessarily treatment for his mental health. Augustine draws this out when he and his interlocutors in the dialogue examine two possible explanations for Arata's unhappiness. First, one of the interlocutors suggests that Arata is unhappy because although he has everything he needs, he still wants more than he has. Secondly, they suggest that Arata is unhappy because he fears losing all that he has. Both of these seem like plausible explanations. However, Augustine does not affirm either explanation without returning to the question, what more could a human being want? What more could a human being need? Does Arata really have everything he needs? Does this case truly present a counter-argument to the earlier definition of happiness as fulfillment and misery as need? For as both of these suggested explanations imply, Arata is in need. In particular, he is in need of virtue. The first explanation implies that Arata lacks moderation. That is, he has inordinate or excessive desire for wealth, bodily pleasure, or some external material good. Of course, as Augustine notes, we do not know if Arata really does want more than he has. But if he does, and if this explains his unhappiness, we can conclude that he is unhappy because he lacks moderation. On the other hand, the second explanation implies that Arata is unhappy because of a lack of courage, or perhaps more specifically, a lack of the related virtue of hope. If it really is the case that Arata is unhappy because he fears that he will lose these external goods, knowing that he could lose them easily with one wrong turn of fortune, and knowing that they are impermanent goods, then his fear is misplaced. He is overly concerned with earthly goods and lacks the hope of something eternal. He seeks security in the material world or the world of fortune rather than the immaterial world or God's providence. Despite such cautionary tales as that of Arata's against the inordinate desire for wealth, status, bodily pleasure, even temporal security, people still commonly locate happiness in these external things. Why, you might wonder? Don't people know better, or can they just not help themselves? Indeed, both seem to be factors preventing us from happiness, as Augustine has indicated in On the Happy Life, and as Aquinas recognizes in his own work, the Summa, where he lists ignorance and inordinate affection as two main reasons for a lack of complete happiness in this life. Thus, a real problem can be of not knowing what you want, or perhaps even better, of not knowing what you need. Knowledge, or a particular kind of knowledge, is thus essential for happiness. In fact, rather than point to Arata's lack of moderation or courage directly, Augustine ends up pointing to Arata's lack of wisdom, a certain kind of knowledge, as the reason for his unhappiness. He and his interlocutors, guided by the insight of his mother Monica, conclude, this man of ours, Arata, who was rich and wealthy, desired nothing more, as you say. Still, because he was afraid that he would lose his possessions, he was in need of wisdom. If he had needed silver and money, would we not call him needy? Shall we not call it need when he needs wisdom? The dialogue then focuses on the neediness of the mind. Thus, happiness becomes connected with fulfilling the needs of the mind through cultivating the virtues, especially wisdom and moderation. Augustine claims that a person is happy not by virtue of the things, but by virtue of the moderation of the mind that he possesses. In other words, happiness is found not through external material goods, but through internal goods, such as wisdom and moderation. Because humans have both a soul and a body, they need two types of nourishment, on Augustine's view. That is to say, they need food for the body, for example, bread, fruits, vegetables, medicine, etc. And they need food for the soul or mind. In On the Happy Life, Augustine claims that the soul is nourished by nothing other than the understanding and knowledge of things. This lends support to the claim that learning is not only good for human beings, but necessary for their happiness. Indeed, Augustine states, "For just as the body, when it is deprived of food, is frequently full of diseases, and these defects indicate starvation in the body, so too are their minds full of diseases by which they confess their hunger." In other words, a person who is deprived of knowledge and understanding is like a person deprived of food. They are starved and can suffer diseases or states of illness, lack of health, and well-being. Augustine later clarifies that there are symptoms of mental and spiritual hunger, similar to how there are symptoms of physical hunger. Starvation is the stage of a severe hunger or malnutrition, but even before that, there are symptoms one might notice. In the case of the body, there will be a rumbling stomach, dizziness, and fatigue. In the case of the soul, there would be fear, sorrow, desire, and what other things through which even miserable human beings admit that they are miserable. Interestingly, Augustine suggests that people are often aware that they are unwell and unhappy, that they are empty or lacking in something. After all, they are suffering emotionally, experiencing especially anxiety and an absence of meaning and love. The spiritual and intellectual sickness overcomes one when one does not have true knowledge, especially knowledge of who and what one really is as a human being. Similar to Augustine, Aquinas also conceives of the human being as a unity of soul and body, and Aquinas refers to his understanding of human nature in order to explain what is necessary for happiness. In fact, generally, Aquinas is taken to emphasize the unity of soul and body even more than Augustine, who in some texts appears to be more dualistic. One of Aquinas' main arguments for the inadequacy of temporal things alone for happiness is that the purpose of goods of the body is not for the body, but for the whole person, especially for the person's soul. He explains that even granting that the end of human beings' reason and will is the preservation of the human being, it still cannot be said that the end of a human being is some good of the body, for a human being consists of soul and body. Here Aquinas points out that even if one held that the purpose of human life is merely survival or sustenance, human happiness cannot exist in only securing physical goods, such as bodily health or basic survival necessities like food and shelter, because a human being is not purely a bodily being. A human being has a soul as well as a body. Thus, bodily goods alone are insufficient even for the survival of the human being. Humans are in need of other goods, that is, goods of the soul, to be who and what they are. Echoing Augustine, Aquinas claims that the human being needs the virtues not only for happiness in the sense of flourishing, but also for a minimal sense of happiness as contentment. One can further notice Aquinas' emphasis on the unity of the soul and body in his distinction between imperfect happiness and perfect happiness. Rather than emphasize the importance of neglecting the soul, here he emphasizes the importance of bodily goods for human happiness, especially for imperfect happiness. Aquinas explains, happiness is of two kinds. in an imperfect one, which is had in this life, and a perfect one, which consists in the vision of God. Now it is clear that the body is necessary for happiness in this life. For happiness in this life consists in an activity of the intellect. But activity of the intellect in this life cannot go on without a phantasm or image, which can only belong to a corporeal organ. Thus, the happiness which we have in this life depends in a certain way on the body. Here, Aquinas makes two important points. First, he notes that humans have a kind of incomplete or imperfect happiness in this life on earth, but they are capable of having perfect or true complete happiness in the next life when they can see God. As he clarifies elsewhere, although imperfect, people think there is some happiness in this life because of a similarity of it to true happiness, and they are not altogether wrong in so thinking. In other words, Aquinas agrees with the common opinion that humans can be happy in this life, while admitting that this is not the ultimate fulfillment of human existence. Secondly, Aquinas acknowledges that the body is essential for human happiness. Especially in this life, human beings depend on their bodies. A clear example of this is in our pursuit of knowledge. Our intellects make use of information gathered from our 5 external senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, etc., and processed by our brain's internal sense powers, the imagination, and memory. Without the senses, we would lack knowledge in this life, because our intellect cannot function without the images or content we gain through sense experience. Knowledge, or the activity of the intellect more broadly, is required for happiness. And happiness itself is an intellectual activity, according to Aquinas. Thus, happiness, at least indirectly, requires the body. In addition to needing our bodies in order to engage in intellectual activity in this life, we depend on our bodies for virtue of all sorts. It is not only the intellectual virtues specifically, but also moral or character virtues, for example, courage, generosity, love, and moderation, that can be more easily developed through a well-disposed body. In fact, indisposition of the body, that is an illness, can hinder a person's development of virtue. Thus, Aquinas persistently claims that the well-being of the body is important for happiness, especially imperfect happiness. A person's focus on bodily health or the acquisition of wealth, then, are quite understandable and, in fact, good. Still, these should not be the people's sole focus, since such a focus would cause a neglect of other essential elements of being. Moreover, Aquinas, like Augustine, makes the stronger claim that not only must people remember to focus on the development of their soul or mind, and not only the body, the soul should be their priority. In other words, there is a proper ordering of one's desires or loves that is conducive to attaining happiness. While human beings are a unity of soul and body, they are primarily their soul. Thus, people should love their souls and the souls of other human beings above their bodies, says Aquinas. And happiness is found primarily through the soul, as the body functions for the sake of the soul rather than vice versa. This proper ordering of loves is why Augustine, in his Soliloquies, proclaims that all he yearns to know and love are God and the soul. Moreover, he seeks only what can contribute to his health. Thus, he asks his interlocutor not to question him about food and drink, or the baths, or any other bodily pleasure, because he has an appetite for only what can contribute to his health. Here I would suggest Augustine is not so much denying the value of the body as he is redirecting or orienting his own desires toward the soul. For someone like Augustine himself, who is notorious for his struggles with bodily passions, one needs to focus on the soul and God in such a wholehearted way as to balance himself out and remind himself that the internal goods are where happiness primarily lies. For without them, the external goods will not serve a person well. Yet, while happiness is especially found through internal goods or virtues, the object of happiness is not possession of the virtues or internal goods themselves. Both Augustine and Aquinas are firm on this point, which explains why Augustine and Aquinas seek knowledge of God and not only the soul. Aquinas clarified that happiness is something belonging to the soul, but that the object of happiness is something outside the soul. In particular, following Aristotle, Aquinas maintains that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Thus, while internal goods or virtues give rise to one's happiness, they are not what ultimately fulfill a person in some significant sense. Aquinas' argument for this conclusion proceeds as follows. Now, human appetite or will is for a universal good, but any good inhering in the soul is a participated good, and hence a partial good. Consequently, none of the goods belonging to the soul can be the ultimate end of the human being. But if we are speaking of the ultimate end of the human being as the attainment, possession, or any use of the thing which is desired as an end, then something on the part of the soul of the human being does pertain to the ultimate end, since the human being attains happiness through the soul. Here it will be helpful to remind ourselves once more that happiness is the fulfillment of the human being's desire for the complete or perfect good. Since one's own qualities, activities, and virtues are not complete goods in themselves, but participated goods dependent on something else, they will not be the object of happiness. Later, Aquinas explains that only God or the divine essence can make the human being perfectly happy because God is completely good and unparticipated being. Main theme in Augustine's On the Happy Life as well is that happiness is having God. And one of the main definitions of having God he provides is living well, through which one can thoroughly enjoy God. Thus, for both Augustine and Aquinas, happiness is linked to living well or being virtuous as a way of having God. Furthermore, by virtue, they mean excellence or some perfection of the soul. That is, a realization or fulfillment of the human being's intellectual and affective capacities. Two central virtues that they focus on are moderation and wisdom. I will next turn to examining how moderation and wisdom work together in unifying both the human desire for happiness and the human desire for knowledge. However, let us remember that neither happiness nor knowledge and virtue are for the sake of human fulfillment alone. They are ultimately done not merely for the human being, but for God, or better yet, for the human being's union with God. Aquinas summarizes this point well. The human being is ordered to something else as an end, since the human being is not the supreme good. That would be God. In particular, human beings live for knowledge and love of God. This is why Augustine famously says in the opening of the Confessions that the human being is restless until he rests in God. Do not have all we want or need until we have God, that is, knowledge and love of him who is the ultimate good, the infinite and perfect. Having considered the desire for happiness in some detail, I will discuss the desire for knowledge more specifically. Just as human beings desire happiness, so too they desire knowledge, according to Augustine and Aquinas. In fact, desiring knowledge is as natural of a desire for a human being as happiness. As I suggested earlier, this might strike many people today as less obvious than the desire for happiness. But it becomes plausible when one broadens one's sense of knowledge and one realizes that just as there are beneficial and harmful ways of pursuing happiness, as well as complete and incomplete ways, so too there are beneficial and harmful ways, as well as complete and incomplete ways of pursuing knowledge. Why one pursues knowledge, what sources of knowledge one pursues, and how much one pursues knowledge are all important for one's overall attainment of intellectual virtue and ultimately happiness. Before investigating into specific intellectual virtues related to wisdom and moderation, it's worth examining Aquinas' account of the human desire for knowledge. This will also give us insight into why human beings pursue knowledge. In his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, Aquinas provides his analysis of Aristotle's famous line, "All human beings naturally desire to know." According to Aquinas, there are three reasons why human beings have this desire for knowledge. First, each thing naturally desires its own perfection. Therefore, since the intellect, by which the human being is what he is, considered in itself, is all things potentially, and becomes them actually only through knowledge, because the intellect is none of the things that exist before it understands them, as is stated in Book 3 of On the Soul, so each human being naturally desires knowledge. Here, Aquinas connects the human desire for knowledge with the human desire for one's own perfection. People want to gain knowledge because knowledge helps them to realize their intellect, which is what especially makes human beings who they are. In more ordinary terms, Aquinas is affirming the view that people strive to realize their potential. Learning is a way of becoming all one can be. The second reason Aquinas offers for why human beings desire knowledge is related. People are inclined to their proper operation, which is understanding or scientific knowledge. By understanding or scientific knowledge, Aquinas means a comprehensive, explanatory comprehension of what makes something what it is essentially. There's some crossover with what we mean in contemporary English by science. For example, astronomy, botany, and chemistry would all be sciences in that they aim at and provide causal explanations of planets, plants, and elements. However, non-empirical disciplines such as logic, mathematics, and grammar would also be sciences because of their explanatory functions in terms of abstract reasoning, quantification, and language. Following Aristotle, Aquinas thinks that human beings have the potential to gain this type of knowledge. Both define human beings as rational animals. This means that human beings are a particular type of biological organism, but they are unique among biological organisms, at least as far as we know, in having an intellect. Rational indicates that human beings have an intellect or capacity to think universally. Not necessarily that human beings make logical decisions or achieve understanding, though. After all, one can use one's mind well or poorly. However, the definition of human beings as rational animals does imply that human beings are capable of gaining understanding given the proper circumstances. Some people might not actually achieve understanding because of the difficulty of attaining it or because of some other occupations. They might be concerned with the pleasures or needs of the present life, or they may even avoid the effort that learning demands because they are lazy, Aquinas admits. Still, the capacity and desire remains overall part of human nature. Presumably, much of contemporary American society agrees, as we offer public and private education aimed at scientific knowledge to all children under the assumption that they can learn how to read, to write, to do math, etc., albeit with varying levels of success. The last reason Aquinas provides for why humans desire to know is as follows. It is desirable for each thing to be united to its source, since it is in this that the perfection of each thing consists. Now, it is only by means of his intellect that the human being is united to the separate substances, which are the source of the human intellect and that to which the human intellect is related as something imperfect to something perfect. It is for this reason, too, that the ultimate happiness of a human being consists in this union. Here, Aquinas very directly connects the desire for knowledge with the desire for happiness. We desire to know because we desire our happiness, which comes through union with the separate substances, that is, with other intelligible beings, angels and God. While human beings are not separate substances, since they are soul-body unities, they are intelligible beings. Certain forms of knowledge connect us with God as the cause of all. Thus, these natural reasons for pursuing knowledge are related to what human beings are. We are intellectual creatures. However, these natural reasons for pursuing knowledge are not necessarily ones that we are conscious of. And people can have several other reasons for why they pursue knowledge, especially when they understand their identities as rooted in something other than their nature as rational animals or as intellectual creatures made in the image and likeness of God. Aquinas and Augustine both recognize that human beings often pursue knowledge for four main reasons: bodily pleasure, status, practical concerns, and contemplation. It is pursuing knowledge in a contemplative manner that will provide happiness ultimately, though. By itself, knowledge gained through the senses is good. In fact, for Aquinas, sensation is the first step toward achieving more complete forms of knowledge and the intellectual virtues. This is fairly obvious in the case of empirical sciences or the acquisition of hands-on skills. However, sensory experience is key for liberal arts as well. One needs to be able to see, hear, or touch to be able to gain conceptual information transmitted through words, for example. It is not so much the senses, then, that are problematic, as it is one's delight in them alone without aiming at a higher good. That is, one main concern with pursuing knowledge for bodily pleasure is that it could lead to a failure to recognize one's full cognitive capacities and thus one's own good or happiness. One might seek immediate sensory gratification to such an extent that one is constantly striving for new sensations or experiences without taking the time to process, question, and reflect on that sensory information. In other words, one would have a lot of images in one's mind, but one would lack genuine understanding of what, how, and why things are. One would lack what we might call scientific and artistic knowledge, as well as critical thinking skills, self-awareness, ethical reasoning, or wisdom. Another concern is that it would lead one to have knowledge primarily about material realities. To what extent could one have knowledge of oneself, of God, or of immaterial realities in general, whether in mathematics, ethics, or religion, if one is primarily seeking knowledge from the senses? Augustine and Aquinas are both concerned about this throughout their works. Of course, why one pursues knowledge, consciously or unconsciously, affects what kind of knowledge one pursues. Consider once more the analogy Augustine presents between two types of nourishment or food for the body and food for the soul. In On the Happy Life, Augustine points out that there are people who are starving for knowledge. These are the people mentioned earlier who are miserable because they are in need. One subset of these are simply those who have not been educated. Augustine mentions how difficult it is to be fulfilled without access to the arts and sciences, especially if one has not been granted wisdom as a divine gift like his mother Monica. Many people are starving for knowledge because of what they are consuming, not merely the absence of all knowledge, though. According to Augustine, symptoms of unhappiness occur not only when one has had too little nourishment for the soul, they also occur when one has had nourishment of an unhealthy kind. That is, what one consumes in terms of knowledge is important, just as what one consumes in terms of food is important. For instance, when one eats only simple carbohydrates or highly processed foods, one will lack essential vitamins, fiber, and protein necessary for the body to function well, even if one has sufficient calories. Likewise, when one consumes sources of knowledge that are also lacking in nutrients, one will not be intellectually and spiritually fulfilled, even if one's mind is full of information. What are such innutritious sources of knowledge? Augustine mentions distractions and entertaining games, such as gladiator fights and effusive theatricals. These are primarily for the pleasure of the senses alone. But he also has in mind the forms of knowledge one might receive at a school or college that emphasizes ambition, social prestige, intelligent gymnastics, or facts over genuine understanding and wisdom. He has in mind the education he received as a boy and young adult that emphasized social mobility versus the education he would promote and receive later at the university that emphasized moral and intellectual knowledge of intelligible realities, including one's soul and God. While Augustine's argument about innutritious sources of knowledge are unfortunately still relevant today, as we live in a society that prioritizes entertainment and often prizes prestige and quantifiable intelligence on examinations, another especially prominent contemporary example is much of what is found on the internet and social media. There, one's minds can quickly be filled with information, but much of it can be sensory distractions or matters of status. For example, online shopping, gossip, and much of what is called news. Furthermore, even if people are exposed to sufficient nutritious sources of food for the soul, and that is genuine knowledge through the arts and sciences, they are not necessarily happy and healthy. For it is not enough to have an abundance of healthy food, one must also be concerned with how much one eats. Undoubtedly, it is much harder to eat excessive quantities of fruits and vegetables than sweets and salty snacks, but one can still overindulge to the point of indigestion. Similarly, although it is often more difficult to be excessive in seeking genuine knowledge and wisdom than in seeking entertainment, one can still be overeager in pursuing it and not well attuned to the need for rest or fasting. Augustine describes those who are the opposite of those who are starving for knowledge. These are people whose mind runs over into luxuries, despotisms, acts of pride, and the other things of this kind, by which the minds of immoderate and miserable men reckon that they will be procuring for themselves joy and power. Such people have an excess of knowledge due to pride and ambition that leads them to use knowledge for their own status over concern for others and their own good. Unfortunately, as Augustine suggests, these people are often not aware of their excesses. They might not have the same symptoms as those who do not have enough food for the soul. Subjectively, they could feel good and do not as commonly experience anxiety and sadness as symptoms of unhappiness. How are we to understand such people then? For at first glance, there is a tension in Augustine's text here. Do such people really have an excess of nutritious food for the soul? Perhaps. Indeed, Augustine appears to imply that they have true beliefs and genuine scientific and artistic understanding, mentioning such people along with those who have received a liberal arts education, and warning himself and his companions that they too could become excessive in their pursuit of knowledge. This is a theme that he presents throughout on the Happy Life, in which he beckons his interlocutors to end for the day. Having philosophized enough, they are to enjoy a light meal, go for a walk, and then rest for the night. In a similar manner, Aquinas encourages moderation and knowledge through cultivating the virtue of studiousness and avoiding the vice of curiosity. Aquinas points out that it belongs to the virtue of moderation to moderate the movement of the appetite, lest it tend excessively to that which is desired naturally. Now, just as in respect of his corporeal nature, the human being naturally desires the pleasures of food and sex, so in respect of his soul, he naturally desires to know something. That is to say, all human desires or appetites need to be regulated. One can go to the excess or the deficiency in one's appetite for knowledge. One can seek it too much or too little. While the deficiency in the desire for knowledge might strike us as more common, since teachers, professors, and parents often are required to motivate students to study and to encourage passion for the subject matter, the excess in the desire for knowledge is also very common. As Aquinas notes, one form of excess in the desire for knowledge occurs when a human being is withdrawn by a less profitable study from a study that is an obligation incumbent on him. In other words, a person is still seeking knowledge, however, he's seeking knowledge that is less valuable for him and in conflict with his duties, such as at work or school. Instead of paying attention to the task at hand, the person distracts himself by seeking to think about something else. The information that the person receives in this way can be good insofar as it is true. However, the desire encourages a kind of pride or self-centeredness that is really not beneficial to the person himself or to others. Overall, then, people can be said to have too much knowledge or be too excessive in their pursuit of it. Nevertheless, they cannot have too much wisdom, properly speaking, according to Augustine and Aquinas. For wisdom is what is lacking in the case of people who have too much or too little of nourishing food for the soul. Augustine mentions here that wisdom and moderation are intertwined. Thus, wisdom is not merely having genuine knowledge. Wisdom is the measure of the mind, that is, that by which the mind balances itself, the result being that it neither runs into excess, nor is it constricted by what is less than full. Hence, Augustine mentions moderation as a key internal good to cultivate along with wisdom. While Aquinas agrees with Augustine's unification of moderation and wisdom, he reminds us about the significance of different forms of wisdom and knowledge as well, the practical and the theoretical. By practical, he means knowledge that aims at some good outside of knowing itself, a form of instrumental or utilitarian knowledge, such as seeking knowledge in order to maintain life. By theoretical or speculative, he means knowledge that is intrinsically good and valuable in itself, such as appreciation of the truth and beauty of existence. According to Aquinas, happiness consists in activity of the speculative or theoretical intellect rather than the practical. Moreover, ultimate and complete happiness, which we look for in a future life, consists entirely in contemplation. Imperfect happiness, such as can be had in this life, consists principally in contemplation, but secondarily in the operation of the practical intellect directing human actions and passions. The theoretical intellect is the human being's highest power or capacity. It is what we are most of all as rational creatures. And it is what we have in common with God and the angels, as Aquinas noted in his commentary on the metaphysics. Thereby, the realization of it will enable us to be most happy. Additionally, the practical intellect is ordered to a good outside of itself, whereas the speculative intellect has a good within it, the contemplation of truth. And if this good is perfect, the whole human being is thereby perfected and made good. The practical intellect does not have such a good, but directs a human being toward it. In other words, the speculative or theoretical intellect provides us with the possession of truth that is worth knowing in itself. It is having truth, not merely desiring it. In both this life and the next, happiness is a primarily contemplative activity, as one actually has what one desires: God, the truth, the good, or some aspect of it. Augustine echoes this point when connecting knowledge with the possession of truth, which makes one both wise and happy. Happiness is having the virtues through which one can enjoy God. Wisdom and moderation are two intertwined and especially significant virtues to cultivate in our lives. What does it mean for us today to pursue moderation and wisdom in our search for knowledge? What does this look like in the university? What does this look like on a personal level? Augustine and Aquinas at least suggest that it looks like a tempered pursuit of knowledge, pursued for the good instead of pleasure and status, with a focus on sources that meet the real needs within us, that provide truths of nature, ethics, and metaphysics. It is recognition that what one pays attention to, what one studies and thinks about, affects one's overall health and happiness, for better or worse.
Thank you. We have now time for questions, so please.
Go ahead.
So would you say that knowledge is something that is measurable, but wisdom is a position which we should try and orient ourselves around? Where you speak how you can have excess of knowledge, but you can't have excess of wisdom.
Like,
Does that make sense, or?
is it quantifiable? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I guess you could try to quantify wisdom, but like, there isn't an excess. I mean, because there is a minimum, like it would be said to have too little wisdom, I guess. That's kind of what they're saying, but I think because it's so tied to moderation, kind of like what I was saying, it doesn't like, I don't know, it's like saying, can a person be too good? Right? Like, in some sense, no. I mean, right? I mean, if you really mean they're really good, you can't be too good in some sense. So I think that's kind of, whereas with knowledge, it's not the same type of entity. It's like, yeah.
It's just one part of the bigger picture, knowledge perception versus wisdom being more encompassing.
Well, I mean, I guess that would be like a whole other topic or paper if we want to talk about what is wisdom, but I guess they kind of conceive of wisdom as like two different types of wisdom. I didn't go into this too much in the paper here, but in other sections. So Aquinas is going to be pretty influenced by Aristotle. It might be helpful to think of, which maybe, I don't know, the next speaker talks about this on Aristotle and happiness, but anyway, Aristotle talks about there's these steps toward wisdom or steps towards knowledge. And all of our kind of, I guess the first step towards wisdom is sensation, kind of like what Aquinas is saying, using your five senses, right? But we kind of build up from that to what are called like the arts and sciences, which is kind of like what we're studying in schools, but also could be like skills that you're learning outside of school as well, right? So, but scientific knowledge, I can give the example, yeah, what we call in English science, right? Chemistry or biology, those are going to be sciences. But we could also say logic's a kind of science, or, the art of, I don't know, carpentry, for example, right? Would be those are a kind of skill, but like, so I think his idea is we could kind of build up knowledge of different types of sciences or arts. I guess we'd quantify that, like, oh, these are the ones I know, or these are the ones that I have a certain mastery of, or, I think you can quantify the arts and sciences to some extent, or at least that's, I guess, what we try to do a little bit in education. But wisdom, like, was going to be really hard to kind of measure. Again, I think you can kind of know because of certain symptoms that maybe you're lacking in it, but it's not going to be something like knowing. It's more all encompassing, I guess, right? So they think of wisdom as kind of two different types, like a practical wisdom, which is very much like a moral kind of reasoning. You know, which would be like, I don't know, knowing the appropriate advice to give someone, right? Or kind of a theoretical wisdom, which is gonna be kind of like knowing the divine things, or, you know, you can't really have too much of that, because again, knowing the divine, well, that'd be kind of like knowing the form of the good, you know, like Plato's view, so like, you can't really have too much good, so if that helps.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Mhm. Yeah,
So to what extent, this is a two-parter,
okay.
to what extent do you think Augustine and Aquinas would agree with the cliche, ignorance is a bliss?
Okay.
And does ignorance relate more to a lack of wisdom or more to a lack of knowledge in general?
Okay, so is ignorance more a lack of knowledge or a lack of wisdom? Yeah, this comes up in one part of the On the Happy Life. I can't remember exactly what it was. I remember writing in my book, "Is ignorance bliss?" But anyway, but I guess ignorance could be bliss about what kind of, if we're considering what types of knowledge too, right? So this is kind of a thing that came up towards the end of my piece, you know, like how much knowledge, but also what sources of knowledge. Seems like there are a lot of things that like maybe you are better off not knowing, or at least it, I don't know, what does it add to your life? Like knowing, like, I mean, I think someone laughed at my joke about the news or something, but anyway, like, does it really add to my life to know about the news? To some extent, yes, but I don't know, is it even really telling me actual events, or are those really things that are important for me to know, or how much, right? Like, do I need to know every single detail about the news? It seems like maybe not, or I don't know. There are anyway a lot of like facts or information that aren't even like, they're not arts and sciences, they're just maybe sensory information or experiences that like, seems to me like your life is definitely fine without having those. And maybe like, maybe you don't want to experience those things, you know, like it could be, I don't know, overly violent, for example, or something. So I guess I would say, I don't, yeah, ignorance might be bliss sometimes, depending on what it is, but also you do need, ignorance isn't bliss, I guess, if you're thinking of the wisdom. I mean, that's kind of his whole point, like the story of Arada, at least, I think, you know, he doesn't have wisdom. And like basically the whole thing that Augustine's drawing out, which Aquinas would also agree with, you can't be happy if you don't have wisdom. Like, because again, you could have every single external good, but if you don't know what to do with your external goods, you don't really know how to value them properly. You're lacking something within you. You aren't like, they can't be blessed. So I think they're going to say, without wisdom, you can't have bliss. So, but also even without knowledge, like I think I had this one quote, but Augustine makes an even stronger quote, like with the, I mean, he makes a very strong argument for education. Like he basically says, like, if you don't have access to the arts and sciences, it's going to be really hard for you to be unhappy. Which a lot of people today would find, whoa, that's a really strong claim. But he's kind of saying, well, like his mother who wasn't educated, he does take as like a very wise person, but that's kind of rare. And so like you kind of need access to education of certain sorts in order to, yeah, be happy. So I mean, it matters what the knowledge is of or what you're ignorant of in order to kind of have the happiness. Yeah.
Would you say then that ignorance is a kind of pleasure, then I guess, one that fades?
Ignorance is a type of pleasure, one that fades. What do you have in mind by like fading?
Well, because ignorance is the absence of knowledge.
Mhm.
It's safe to say that once you ignore it.
So your original question again?
Would you say ignorance is like one pleasure that fades? That would fade?
Well, it matters what we mean. I guess that is the whole thought. What do we mean? This is the philosopher. What do we mean by pleasure? I guess, right? I mean, I think the examples that come to mind, or I brought up kind of with like the sensory distraction, or when, you know, in some sense, when you're seeking distraction, technology, right, is kind of like the main example, but I mean, I guess before technology, complete daydreaming or whatever, right? I mean, you're trying to distract yourself in some way, so you are trying to be ignorant maybe of the task at hand, like, I don't know, you don't want to do your work or schoolwork or whatever it is. And maybe you're taking pleasure in the distraction instead, which I guess pleasure isn't necessarily a bad thing either, right? I mean, you could take pleasure in your schoolwork, and I didn't talk about this much in the paper, but like ultimately, like the greatest pleasure is like intellectual, right? I mean, that's the contemplation, right? And the 401 class that I teach, we sometimes talk about this, like philosophy, right? The liberal arts in general, not just philosophy, but music is a good example. A lot of people can relate to. Why are you doing music? Because you love it, right? Or why do people listen to music? Because they love it, because they appreciate, they recognize the beauty of it. So there is like a pleasure element within that, but it's like a, you know. So I guess I would say pleasure can also motivate you to seek knowledge or to want more of it. So matters, I guess, what kind of thing you're taking pleasure in.
It seems to me there's an analogy between what you said at the beginning of your talk about desire being rightly directed and desiring knowledge of the proper sort, right? So for instance, if I desire a family-sized bag of pork rinds
Yeah.
to eat, you know, until it's completely empty and then the worst possible thing for me would be to have my desire satisfied, right? I'd probably die. Okay. And so, you know, so ignorance is bliss is kind of the question. That's a lack, right? That's a need. So it's a potentiality which is not actualized. But if you have a desire for knowledge which is not good, then it would actually be a punishment for you to be given what you want, right? To acquire that knowledge. And so happiness consists not just in having knowledge, but in wanting the right kind of knowledge and then having, you know, wanting something that's wholesome and then closing the jaws of your mind around that. Then you're comfortable.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And that kind of, it really does connect, you know, the parts of your talk, right?
Mhm.
The happiness, desire, right? And knowledge as really a species of, you know, that want of nourishment.
Can you go a little bit more in detail about what they meant by contemplation and what that's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, different senses of, I guess, contemplation, but I mean, part of it's like contemplating divine essence, beatific vision. I guess that's kind of like the perfect happiness, right? Or the form of the good, if people want to think of it as like, I don't know, Plato's form of the good, right? So it's like, yeah, you're face to face with this ultimate perfect good, and that's what you're staring at. But like even in this life, Aquinas says the kind of imperfect happiness consists in contemplation. And so I think one way of thinking of contemplation is connecting it to like what I was like earlier, the liberal arts, like practice a certain way. The whole idea of the liberal arts, like if you're pursuing music or literature or philosophy, is beauty. And like you're just kind of so absorbed in that activity that you're just saying, I'm doing it because I love it, right? The kind of like the passion. I mean, people can pursue other things contemplatively too. But it is something where you're kind of in that state of just, I don't know, your attention's completely focused on it, right? And I think also just out in nature, sometimes when people are out on like a nature walk or a nature hike, you know, and they just are, you know, well, we don't have spring yet, but when spring emerges or fall, right, and the leaves are really pretty, that's my favorite. You know, people just stare up at the leaves and say, wow, look at how beautiful this is. That's contemplation, right? Like we're kind of like time stops and you're just immersed in the emotion and you're kind of like, what else do I need in life? This is all I need, right? So, yeah.
Why is curiosity a vice?
Well, what does he mean by curiosity? I guess that's right. Great. So, yeah, it's kind of, well, this comes up more. Augustine's actually known more for considering usually curiosity is a vice, but Aquinas is saying, so all virtues have their vices, right? So there's kind of like, there's the mean or kind of wanting something not to the excess or the deficiency. But curiosity, you could say, is wanting it, well, I guess a couple ways. You could say wanting knowledge too excessively, or maybe not wanting the right kind of knowledge, right? So you could be curious about things that are actually harmful to your well-being or something like this, you could say. You could also say, I think the smartphones example is definitely the one that I come to all the time, maybe because I teach and I see this every day. And I also didn't have a smartphone for the longest time, so observing this in other people is just like, okay, this is curiosity right here, right? The whole like, let's look it up on the phone like immediately, or like not being able to put your phone down. That's the vice of curiosity, right? I mean, it's kind of like your mind is always seeking knowledge. People think it's the opposite. They think, oh, students who are on their phone don't want knowledge. No, they do want knowledge. They just don't want the knowledge. Knowledge. They want to know about the sports game or I don't know, what their friends are up to or, what's happening at home or whatever. That's fine. But it's kind of like, if you're constantly kind of distracting yourself in a certain way, you're constantly seeking that knowledge. You're kind of not seeking knowledge in things that are actually, I don't know, like learning a certain skill, for example, or learning about stuff that's actually, you could say, practically useful or even kind of like good for you contemplatively. But I didn't emphasize this too much in the talk, but also how I did a little bit, like we kind of need to give our minds a rest, right? I mean, like Augustine mentions this a lot in his dialogues, like you need to stop your work, stop, eat, go to bed, and like you could say if we're constantly curious, it's going to be hard to kind of like stop, eat, and like go to bed, right? And like we kind of know this in modern society, a lot of people probably relate to this. I mean, I'm definitely kind of someone on the side of like always wanting to know in some sense, and not necessarily with smartphones, but you could be excessive in your own work too. I mean, research, right? This is something I was talking about with the ambition people might have. I don't know, people pursuing college degrees, PhDs, or anything, because you want to know, you could be too excessive to the point of like burnout, right? So it seems like curiosity isn't like healthy for you necessarily.
Do they have like a different word for like a healthy desire for knowledge?
Yeah, studious, or what's translated as studiousness. Right, so what's kind of interesting is the word studiousness or the term student we have in English, right? Where does that ultimately come from? Or like the Latin word eagerness, which is kind of interesting. But a student should be eager to learn, but also not overly eager, right? Like there's a certain, I don't know, medium to the eagerness of a student. Yeah.
I saw an article, of course, recently how generally around the world, older people are happier. And I wonder if there's a special key to happiness, which is knowledge of mortality, which is like, I'm going to lose my health, I'm going to lose my ability to take care of myself, but still I can choose to be happy by appreciating beauty, having friends, kind of the pleasures of life, and like the contemplative. So I wonder if that's like a special. Thoughts on that.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I don't know, not necessarily about age, though that could be a case, but I was thinking of the opposite of case of Arata. So Arata in the story, right, is the person who has won the lottery in terms of fortune, right? Has every kind of external good we could wish for. But you could also think of someone who's the opposite of that. Well, a lot of people in modern society, right, who really do not have much for external goods. Like you're saying, like maybe their health is really poor. Maybe they're like in poverty, right? Maybe, they're in a country where they're facing war and, all these things. You could say, well, how could someone be happy given that? Well, we might say, maybe it's easier. Like in some sense, what Augustine talks about in the beginning of On the Happy Life is actually misfortune can make you happy. In some sense, and that's kind of like for himself, like he talks about, he developed a health condition and this kind of motivated him to continue on his path a little bit. But you could say, we say, oh, how unfortunate when someone develops, again, health condition, or how unfortunate we're all gonna, start aging, but how unfortunate if someone loses all kinds of money in the stock market or something like this, house burns down, whatever it is, you might say, that's awful, like how could someone be happy? But you might actually say, actually, that could be kind of a gift towards happiness in some sense, a way of reorienting yourself to like not finding happiness in those things, but trying to find it in like the actual like internal goods. Yeah.
So is the main problem with the idea of too much knowledge, that there is just an excessive knowledge, or that you're ignoring your other needs?
Like, what other needs are you thinking of? Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're just all day reading a book,
Mhm,
you're not getting any sleep, you're not eating,
mhm.
none of those needs are being satisfied.
Well, so that would be that is one of the real problems, right? I mean, I think, yeah, kind of like you were saying, yeah, if someone's so absorbed in the book or whatever it is that they're doing, yeah, you could say, well, they might not be sleeping, they might not be eating, they might not be drinking, they might not be doing other things, yeah.
But if they didn't have those needs, would there still be the problem of too much knowledge? Would that be an issue?
It matters what the knowledge is kind of still in, but it's also a little hard for us, I guess, conceive of in some respects. So think of, okay, so as the human being is now, kind of like I was emphasizing in my talk, we have a soul and a body. So we have all these bodily needs, which is kind of like what you're pointing to. You're saying, but if we didn't have all these bodily needs, if we were just the soul, I guess, could you still have an excessive pursuit of knowledge if you didn't have to worry about your body at all? Right? Like maybe I also could try to kind of make it so that I could get some of my bodily needs met in an easier way. I don't know, being an IV or something, so I don't have to like drink water or something. I don't know, or maybe we come up with some technology so I don't need to sleep as much. I could be on some kind of medication, right, that kind of hypes me up or something. But you could still say, yeah, could you be too excessive even if it had no like harm to your bodily health? Seems like you still could in some of the ways that I was suggesting earlier about matters what are you pursuing, right? Like you could still be too excessive in like the type of knowledge you're trying to pursue. I think anyway, yeah.
Perhaps we have time for one more question.
Go ahead.
So I'm struck by a sort of a tension, maybe contradiction between wants and desires and needs, sort of propelling you toward things, and maybe things like pork rinds can be excessive, and then the combination of that with wisdom, which in the description leads to a more perfect happiness, let's say. And so you experience this perfect happiness. It's an experience, it's something you sense, which would seem to say that your sense of what you want and what you need could itself be the perfect guide. But you can't apparently actually get there unless you also add this extra element that's a little different, that seems to work against what you want. This extra element being wisdom. So I'm just struck by that because it seems like what's inherent, it's almost as if you could trust what your inner wants or needs are telling you. If you could hear it perfectly, it could potentially lead you to the same place that wisdom is taking you also. Just wonder what you think about that.
I think that's kind of right. And that like, and I think one of the reasons why it's hard, like, if you actually had knowledge of what you really needed, which would be a kind of wisdom because you'd have a knowledge of it, then, well, there's also the problem of, I guess, to some extent, if you had that knowledge, would you still do it? So you still have to want it, I guess, to some extent. So there could be some kind of tension between your knowledge and your wanting, or your will and your intellect, I guess. But in some sense, I guess humanly speaking, we have that kind of tension, you could say, or I don't know. Some philosophers emphasize that at least a little bit more than others, but also I do think I guess personally, it does seem sometimes a little harder. Like if people had the knowledge, wouldn't they just do it? Like, but it does seem like sometimes they also don't have the knowledge. I mean, part of the concern is, well, what if you don't actually know who you are, right? Or know what you are. So like one of the big things I tried to draw out at least was like, for example, someone might think, well, all I am is a body. I don't have a soul. I don't have a mind. I mean, materialism, right? I mean, Aquinas is going to say if you have a materialist view and you think you are just purely a physical being, it's going to be really hard for you to be happy. Because you have this kind of false belief that's going to lead you to like follow desires that aren't actually beneficial for you. But if you believe that you have kind of like, he was mentioning, like you have bodily needs, but you also have needs of the soul, and you need to, to some extent, prioritize the needs of the soul, then that's kind of be more of a guide towards happiness or something like this, right? I mean, I do think that is overall, I would say there is kind of a tension in some sense that like we do have natural instincts that are kind of on the right track. I mean, that's kind of what Aristotle is trying to get at with the all human beings desire to know, like, we kind of are aimed at something that's like knowledge is good for the most part, and like we are kind of aimed at, like, likewise, you could say we all have an innate desire to live, right? To survive, and like, so we're gonna seek things like, you know, food or something like that, like physical food too, right? Or anything that's gonna help our survival. Say, well, that's kind of good that we have an appetite that we want to eat. But I think part of it is like, but it needs to be disciplined or trained. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that tension's there. I don't think I can resolve it completely. I think that's also just part of human nature. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Like I said, we have another talk on happiness in about a month. So stay tuned, go to the website. Be right here, April 18, 7 p.m. And if you're interested in contemplation, deeper leisure, the basics of culture, very close to those who are not familiar with deeper stuff.
Did you say leader?
Leisure, the basics of culture by Joseph Lieber. About receptivity to the whole of reality.
Oh, wow. Okay. I like
Yeah.
Yeah, but those requires,
The expectation being like others. Yeah. So, it's good that is there.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you for your organization. Yeah. Thank our unique self.
Sorry, yeah. Is there, like a relationship?
Nice.
Line? So.
It's been here.
Say that.
Very nice.
Now.